Good evening. Tonight we begin with a development that has shaken intelligence communities across Europe and forced NATO's eastern flank into an unplanned elevation of readiness. A development that exposes a vulnerability long assumed to be safeguarded. A development that has triggered one of the most intense overnight intelligence reassessments in recent years. Along a stretch of land spanning over 3,200 kilometers, from the icy waters of the Barents Sea in the north to the turbulent Black Sea in the south, lies the border between Russia and NATO territory. This is one of the most monitored military boundaries on Earth. A border under constant watch, by satellites, by reconnaissance aircraft, by ground-based sensors, and by multiple layers of intelligence agencies whose primary goal is to detect exactly the kind of movement that has now taken place. And yet, this time the detection came late. So late, in fact, that by the time indicators were finally recognized, Russian forces were already in their new positions. The redeployment was complete. The posture changed. The window for early warning had closed. This delay, this unexpected gap between Russian action and NATO awareness, is what triggered last night's sudden alert elevation across Eastern Europe. Because when an adversary can shift significant combat power closer to your borders without immediate detection, the fundamental assumptions behind your defensive planning begin to crumble. This isn't just about troop movement. It's about the loss of warning time, and in modern conflict, warning time is everything. The first signs: a detection failure. The earliest indicators did not come from classified military satellites. They did not come from intercepted Russian communications. They did not come from NATO reconnaissance aircraft patrolling the border. No, the first hints came from commercial satellites. Civilian platforms capturing routine daytime imagery from map services, agricultural analysis, and environmental monitoring. Analysts reviewing these feeds noticed something subtle. Something almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Small convoys. Transport vehicles moving silently along secondary military roads. Lights off. Thermal signatures faint. Traveling during hours when Russian road traffic typically drops to its lowest levels. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable. Russia's military logistics run constantly. Trucks move equipment, supplies, ammunition, and personnel between depots and bases every day. A single convoy means nothing. But then a second convoy appeared, this one nearly 200 kilometers away. And its behavior matched the first. Same timing, same preference for secondary routes, same attempt to minimize visibility, same pattern of movement inconsistent with standard logistics. This is when analysts began correlating imagery, pulling archived frames, working backward to identify the origin points, mapping routes, comparing movement times, analyzing heat signatures. And that's when the picture began to change. The thermal truth. Infrared analysis is one of the most powerful tools in modern intelligence. Engines, exhaust systems, electronic equipment, they all create distinct thermal profiles. When analysts applied thermal overlays to the convoy footage, the results were unmistakable. These were not ordinary supply vehicles. They were heavy equipment transports, the type used for self-propelled artillery, long-range rocket systems, electronic warfare platforms, air defense batteries. And these transports weren't moving just one or two systems. They were moving them in coordinated waves, spaced just enough to avoid attracting attention, yet close enough to be synchronized. By the time NATO's intelligence fusion centers finally compiled all available data, the realization hit with full force. The redeployment was already complete. The units were already forward. The window to detect them in transit had passed. What NATO found was not movement. What NATO found was the result of movement. Forward positioning. A strategic shift. The units Russia moved were not standard reserve formations. They were not rear echelon support units. They were not local garrison forces. Intelligence assessments now indicate that Russia repositioned. Electronic warfare brigades. Long-range artillery systems. Air defense platforms optimized for countering NATO aircraft. Mechanized battalions equipped for rapid offensive or counteroffensive operations. And these forces were moved to locations that expand Russian operational reach into NATO territory without formally crossing any red lines. Russia maintained enough distance to claim defensive posture. But the positioning is close enough to reduce NATO warning time, threaten key alliance territory, complicate reinforcement plans, challenge air dominance, pressure vulnerable borders, create strategic dilemmas overnight. This is why Eastern Europe reacted immediately. Poland's response, a nation that knows its geography. Poland was the first to elevate alert levels. Polish intelligence services have been tracking Russian activity with heightened urgency since the first day of the Ukraine conflict. They maintain their own surveillance networks, independent of NATO, and they analyze the same imagery, arriving at conclusions within minutes. Poland understands a simple but brutal truth. Russian forces in these new positions cut warning time dramatically. Polish planners now face scenarios where missile strikes could occur with little notice. Electronic warfare could disrupt communications instantly. Reinforcement corridors could be targeted early. Alliance decision-making processes could be bypassed entirely. Poland increased border surveillance, strengthened monitoring stations, raised readiness, not fully, but enough to send a clear signal. Poland sees the redeployment as a real and immediate danger. Lithuania, a country for whom warning time is survival. Lithuania followed within hours. This was no surprise. Lithuania sits in one of the most strategically exposed positions in all of NATO. It forms the northern side of the Suwalki Gap, the narrow land corridor that connects Lithuania to Poland and separates Russian territory from Kaliningrad. Lithuania's defense depends almost entirely on NATO. A significant Russian redeployment near its borders is not an academic concern. It is existential. Lithuania issued internal readiness notices. Units were told to prepare for rapid activation. Timelines for response were shortened. Monitoring was intensified. No mobilization. No public alarm. But clear indications that Lithuania perceives Russian intentions as potentially coercive. The Baltic states, watching with historical memory. Estonia and Latvia, the remaining Baltic states, viewed the situation with the most acute sensitivity. These nations have living memory of Soviet occupation. Their strategic cultures are shaped by the question: what happens when Russia moves forces and the West reacts too slowly? To them, redeployment is not a theoretical exercise. It is a warning, a reminder, a signal, and perhaps a test. Germany's dilemma: a system that depends on warning time. Germany responded next. German defense planning relies heavily on one assumption: NATO will have early warning before Russian action. This redeployment challenged that assumption. If Russia can move specialized units without NATO noticing until after positioning is complete, then the core of Germany's national defense strategy must be reconsidered. German commanders demanded rapid intelligence reassessment. Was this a unique event? Or is this the new normal? Did NATO miss the movements? Or has Russian operational security dramatically improved? Can Russia now compress NATO's reaction time whenever it chooses? These are questions with profound implications for German and European security. Russia's perspective: a strategy with multiple purposes. From Moscow's point of view, this redeployment accomplishes several objectives simultaneously. 1. Leverage for future negotiations. By positioning forces near NATO territory, Russia increases its bargaining power in any diplomatic standoff. 2. Demonstration of military resilience. Despite losses in Ukraine, Russia can still execute large-scale coordinated movements with high operational security under NATO surveillance. 3. Testing NATO's detection capability. This redeployment was not just movement of forces. It was a test, a probe into NATO's intelligence blind spots. 4. A strategic warning to NATO. Russia is signaling. Your actions in Ukraine carry consequences elsewhere. NATO's perspective, a threat wrapped in ambiguity. From NATO's viewpoint, however, the redeployment appears aggressive, coercive, destabilizing, potentially preparatory for escalation. Both sides interpret the same action in opposite ways. This is how miscalculations happen. The units matter, and these units are not defensive. The forces Russia moved include electronic warfare systems, long-range artillery, S-300 and S-400 air defense platforms, mobile missile launchers, reconnaissance elements, mechanized rapid deployment units. These capabilities are not primarily defensive. They are meant to deny airspace, interrupt communications, strike deep into enemy territory, support offensive operations, challenge NATO's freedom of movement. This is what concerns NATO the most. Operational security, Russia's success, NATO's warning. The operation required communication silence, coordination across multiple units, precision timing to avoid satellite windows, use of secondary roads, personnel discipline, confidence that intelligence leaks would not occur. Russia succeeded. This success is itself a strategic signal. It means Russia can move forces covertly during a crisis, create surprise conditions, position for rapid escalation, execute fait accompli operations, outpace NATO decision-making. The Suwalki Gap, the most dangerous geography in Europe. NATO planners are particularly alarmed about one location. The Suwalki Gap, a narrow corridor connecting Poland and Lithuania, and separating Russia from Kaliningrad. If Russia pressures this corridor, NATO's ability to reinforce the Baltic states becomes extremely complicated. Russian units moving closer to this geographic choke point pose a challenge NATO cannot ignore. A broader pattern? Intelligence agencies are examining whether the redeployment coincides with increased Russian submarine patrols, elevated bomber activity, cyber operations targeting NATO infrastructure, drone reconnaissance patterns, Russian military exercises scheduled unusually close to borders. Each of these alone is normal activity. Together, they may indicate a coordinated strategy. The real danger: uncertainty. Tonight, the danger is not that Russia is about to attack. The danger is uncertainty. NATO cannot confidently interpret Russian intentions. Russia cannot predict NATO's reactions. Uncertainty forces worst-case planning. Worst-case planning appears aggressive to the other side. Aggressiveness triggers countermeasures. Countermeasures escalate tensions. This is how crises form. A fragile architecture under stress. NATO detected the redeployment late. Eastern Europe elevated alert levels. Russia now sits closer to NATO territory than it did 48 hours ago. And the security architecture that has kept this confrontation stable is now more fragile than before. Neither side wants escalation. But both sides are now operating in an environment where warning time is reduced. Trust is non-existent. Information is incomplete. Reactions are fast. Misinterpretations are likely. This is the narrow path between deterrence and disaster. And tonight, that path just became narrower. The final question. Russia has moved. NATO has responded. Now the only question that matters is, what happens next? Does Russia stop? Does NATO escalate readiness further? Do both sides step back, or does the logic of rivalry push them forward? The forces are positioned. The alerts are raised. And the map of Eastern Europe looks more dangerous tonight than it has in many months.